The Duke who banished his son returned years later to find him begging at his own gate. Richard Ashworth, Duke of Ravenswood, did not recognize the beggar at first. The filthy creature huddled against the iron gates of Ravenswood Manor was just another piece of human wreckage, one of dozens who came seeking charity from the great house's kitchens. But then the beggar looked up as Richard's carriage passed, and those eyes, gray as winter storms, framed by a face hollowed by starvation and hardship, were achingly, impossibly familiar. They were Elizabeth's eyes, his late wife's eyes, the eyes he'd last seen 12 years ago in the face of his 17-year-old son, moments before he'd screamed at the boy to leave and never return, to die in a gutter for all he cared, to take his ungrateful, rebellious, disappointing existence somewhere far from Ravenswood's respectable walls. "Stop the carriage," Richard commanded, his voice emerging strangled. The beggar, no, not a beggar, his son, his boy, his heir, whom he'd thrown away in a fit of rage and grief and misplaced blame, scrambled to his feet with obvious difficulty. One leg dragged uselessly, and Richard could see the twist of an old injury never properly healed. The boy, no, he was a man now, 29 years old if Richard's arithmetic was correct, raised his hands in a gesture that was half supplication, half defense. "Please, sir," his son said, and Richard's heart shattered at the rough, desperate quality of his voice, at the fact that Edmund didn't recognize his own father after 12 years of absence. "Just a coin or two. Haven't eaten in 3 days. Please, I'll move along, won't make trouble." Edmund. The name emerged as barely more than a whisper. Edmund froze. His gray eyes widened with recognition, and then, worse than hatred, worse than rage, with absolute terror. "No," Edmund breathed, already backing away despite his injured leg. "No, please, it'll go. I'm leaving. Please don't." He stumbled, nearly fell, caught himself against the gate with a pained gasp. And Richard realized with horrible clarity that his son, his heir, his boy, the child he'd banished in grief-fueled anger, was terrified that his own father had returned to finish what he'd started 12 years ago, to drive him away again, to hurt him again, to destroy whatever fragile existence Edmund had managed to build from the ashes of his banishment. Wait, before the next confession unfolds. If this story has already stirred your heart, tell us where you're watching from. To make sure you don't miss the next betrayal, kiss, or redemption, subscribe and join our circle. The next heartbeat might change everything. Now, back to the scene. "Edmund, wait," Richard said, stepping down from the carriage. "Please, don't run." But Edmund was already moving, or trying to, his damaged leg betraying him, sending him sprawling onto the frozen ground. He tried to scramble up, panic written across every line of his body, and Richard saw what 12 years of hardship had done to his son. Edmund was skeletal. His clothes, if the rags hanging from his frame could be clothes, were inadequate for the bitter February cold. His hands, when he braced them against the ground, were scarred and calloused beyond recognition. His face, beneath the grime and the premature lines of suffering, still held traces of the beautiful boy he'd been. But they were buried under the evidence of starvation, exposure, and a life lived at the absolute margins of survival. "Edmund, please," Richard said again, moving closer despite every instinct screaming that he should keep his distance, that he'd already done too much damage. God, what happened to your leg?" "Carriage accident, 3 years ago." Edmund had managed to lever himself into a sitting position, his back against the gate, his eyes tracking Richard's every movement like a cornered animal. "Got caught between a cart and a wall. Couldn't afford a surgeon. It healed wrong. Why didn't you come home? Why didn't you—" But Richard stopped because he knew why. because he'd told Edmund to never come back, because he'd said he'd rather his son were dead than darken Ravenswood's doors again, because he'd been so consumed by grief over Elizabeth's death that he'd blamed their 17-year-old son for not being able to save her, for not being the perfect heir Richard had demanded, for simply existing when Elizabeth did not. "You told me to leave," Edmund said flatly. "You told me if I ever came back, you'd have me arrested for trespassing. You told me—" His voice broke. "You told me I killed Mother, that you couldn't stand to look at me, that I was a disappointment and a burden, and you wished I'd never been born." Each word was a knife to Richard's chest. He remembered saying those things, remembered screaming them at 17-year-old Edmund in the weeks after Elizabeth's sudden death from fever, remembered the look on his son's face, devastation, disbelief, desperate hope that his father didn't mean it. And then Richard had made Edmund pack a single bag and had him physically escorted off the property with instructions to never return. That had been 12 years ago. Edmund had been 17, aristocratic, educated, with the bearing and speech of the nobleman he'd been raised to be. Now he was a beggar with a broken leg and terror in his eyes, barely recognizable as the son Richard had thrown away. "I was wrong," Richard said, his voice cracking. "Edmund, I was wrong. About everything. I was drowning in grief, and I took it out on you. And that was... God, that was unforgivable. But please, let me help you now. Let me—" "No," Edmund's voice was hard. "I don't need your help. I don't need anything from you. You're starving. You haven't eaten in 3 days by your own admission. Your leg is... Edmund, you need medical care. You need—" "I need you to leave me alone," Edmund interrupted. "I've survived 12 years without you. I'll survive more. Just go away. Go back to your life and forget you saw me." "I can't forget. Edmund, you're my son. I was your son." Edmund's voice rose, cracked with emotion. "I was your son until you decided I wasn't. Until you decided I was responsible for Mother's death, even though she died of fever and there was nothing anyone could have done. Until you decided your grief mattered more than my existence." He was crying now, tears cutting tracks through the grime on his face. "Do you have any idea what the last 12 years have been like? I was 17 years old, Father. 17. I had no money, no skills beyond what a gentleman's son learns, no references. Nobody would hire me because I spoke like a nobleman but had no family connections. I starved. I slept in doorways. I did things I'm ashamed of just to survive. And then, when I finally found work as a dock laborer, I got crushed in an accident that should have killed me, but instead just left me crippled, so now I can't even do that anymore." Richard felt tears streaming down his own face. "Edmund, I'm so sorry. I'm so terribly, deeply sorry. Sorry doesn't feed me," Edmund shouted. "Sorry doesn't heal my leg. Sorry doesn't give me back 12 years of my life. Sorry doesn't—" He stopped, his breath coming in harsh gasps. "Just go. Please, just leave me what's left of my dignity and go." "No." Richard crouched down so he was at Edmund's level. "No, I won't leave you. Not again. Never again. Edmund, I know I have no right to ask anything of you. I know I destroyed whatever relationship we had. But please, let me help you. Let me get you inside, warm, fed. Let me bring in physicians for your leg. Let me try to fix some of what I broke." "You can't fix this," Edmund said, his voice hollow now, the anger draining into exhausted despair. "There's no fixing this. You threw me away like garbage, and I learned to be garbage. That's what I am now. A beggar, a cripple, someone who'll die in a workhouse or a gutter. You can't make me your son again just because you're feeling guilty." "I don't want to make you my son again," Richard said carefully. "You never stopped being my son, Edmund. Not in the eyes of God, not in the eyes of the law, not—" his voice broke, "not in my heart, though I was too foolish and grief-stricken to remember that for far too long. But you are still Edmund Ashworth, heir to the Ravenswood dukedom. You are still entitled to every protection and privilege that position entails. And I am still your father, who failed you catastrophically, but who desperately wants the chance to do better." Edmund stared at him, and Richard saw the war in his son's eyes, the desperate need to believe, warring with the hard-won knowledge that trust was dangerous, that hope was a luxury starving men couldn't afford. "I don't trust you," Edmund said finally. "I can't trust you. But I also—" he swallowed hard. "I'm so tired, Father. I'm so tired of being cold and hungry and afraid. And if you're offering warmth and food, I'm too desperate to refuse them, even if it's a mistake." "It's not a mistake," Richard said, relief flooding through him so intensely it was almost painful. "I promise you, Edmund, it's not a mistake. I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to—" he stopped himself. "I'm going to try to do what I should have done 12 years ago. Be your father. Not a perfect one, but one who tries." He extended his hand to help Edmund up. His son stared at it for a long moment before slowly, hesitantly, placing his scarred hand in Richard's. The touch broke something in Richard, the physical reality of how much Edmund had suffered, evident in every callus, every scar, every too prominent bone. He pulled Edmund to his feet carefully, supporting his weight when the damaged leg couldn't. "Can you make it to the carriage?" Richard asked gently. "I can walk," Edmund said, but his voice lacked conviction. He managed 3 steps before his leg gave out, and Richard caught him before he could fall. "Let me help," Richard said, and without waiting for permission, he lifted Edmund into his arms. His son was shockingly light, far too light for a man of nearly 30. Richard could feel every rib, every vertebra. Edmund was quite literally starving to death on the doorstep of his own ancestral home. "I've got you," Richard murmured as he carried Edmund to the carriage. "I've got you, son. You're safe now, I promise." Edmund didn't respond. He'd either lost consciousness or simply surrendered to exhaustion. Richard settled him carefully on the carriage bench and climbed in beside him, keeping one arm around Edmund to prevent him from sliding off as the carriage began moving up the long drive to Ravenswood Manor. This was his son, his heir, the boy he'd loved more than life itself until grief had poisoned him into cruelty. And he'd thrown Edmund away, had condemned him to 12 years of suffering, so now the young man couldn't even believe his father's offer of help was genuine. Richard had done that. His anger, his grief, his misdirected blame. He'd taken a 17-year-old boy and condemned him to hell on earth. And now he had to find some way to fix it. Some way to earn back trust he'd shattered so completely that Edmund had literally preferred begging at Ravenswood's gates to asking his own father for help. If Edmund even let him try. The household was in chaos when Richard carried Edmund through the front door. "Your Grace!" Mrs. Patterson, the housekeeper who'd served Ravenswood since before Edmund was born, went pale. "Is that... Dear God, is that Master Edmund?" "It is." "He needs a bedroom prepared immediately, fires lit, hot water for bathing, and every physician in the county summoned." Richard's voice carried the command that had intimidated lords and servants alike. He's severely malnourished, injured, and suffering from exposure. Move, all of you, now!" The staff scattered into action. Richard carried Edmund up the grand staircase to what had been his son's bedroom, the room that Richard had left untouched for 12 years, partly from guilt and partly from some desperate hope that Edmund might one day return. He laid Edmund on the bed and stepped back, really looking at his son for the first time in adequate light. It was worse than he'd thought. Edmund's face was gaunt, his cheekbones sharp enough to cut. His hands bore scars from manual labor, the hands of a gentleman's son transformed into tools by 12 years of desperate survival. His clothes, when Richard carefully began to remove them, were so filthy and threadbare that they practically disintegrated at his touch. And his leg, the left one, the one that dragged, was badly twisted below the knee. An old break, Dr. Morrison would later confirm, that had healed wrong because Edmund hadn't been able to afford medical care. The leg would always be compromised, but with proper treatment it might improve. Mrs. Patterson appeared with a team of maids carrying hot water, clean cloths, and a tray of broth that smelled heavenly. "Master Edmund," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Oh, your grace, what happened to our boy?" "I happened to him," Richard said flatly. "I threw him out, and this is the result. Help me get him cleaned up, Mrs. Patterson. Carefully, he's extremely fragile." Together, they carefully washed Edmund, revealing the full extent of his suffering. His body was a map of hardship, scars from fights or accidents, the marks of frostbite on several fingers, ribs that were shockingly visible beneath his skin. He was more skeleton than man, kept alive only by sheer stubborn refusal to die. When Edmund was finally clean and dressed in one of his old nightshirts, now hanging loose on his wasted frame, Richard sat beside the bed and tried to spoon broth between his son's lips. Edmund's eyes fluttered open. "What? Where?" "You're home," Richard said softly. "At Ravenswood, safe. You need to drink this, Edmund, just a little. Your body needs nourishment." Edmund stared at him with dazed confusion. "This isn't real. I'm hallucinating. Happens when I haven't eaten." "It's real. I'm real. The broth is real. Please, Edmund, drink." Slowly, as if in a dream, Edmund allowed Richard to feed him the broth. He managed perhaps half the bowl before exhaustion claimed him again. Dr. Morrison arrived within the hour, followed by 2 colleagues Richard had summoned from London. They examined Edmund with grave faces and even graver prognoses. "Severe malnutrition," Dr. Morrison said. "He's been starving for months, possibly longer. The leg is badly damaged. That old break will never heal properly now, but we can fit him with a brace that will help him walk more easily. Multiple untreated injuries, some quite old. Probable lung damage from exposure. And psychologically, Your Grace, I cannot imagine the trauma this young man has endured." "Will he survive?" Richard asked, his voice raw. "If we're very careful with refeeding him, if we can prevent infection in his various injuries, if his constitution is strong enough, then yes, he should recover physically. Emotionally?" Dr. Morrison shook his head. "That will take far longer, if it's possible at all." Richard sat vigil at Edmund's bedside for 3 days. His son drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid, sometimes lost in fever dreams, where he called out for his mother or begged invisible tormentors for mercy. Each cry, each plea, each broken fragment of nightmare was another knife to Richard's conscience. He'd done this. He'd taken a grieving boy and broken him so thoroughly that 12 years later he still carried the scars. On the morning of the 4th day, Edmund woke fully lucid. His eyes found Richard immediately and hardened. "You're still here." "Where else would I be?" Richard set aside the book he'd been reading aloud, one of Edmund's childhood favorites. "How are you feeling?" Like I've been beaten by every dockworker in London. Edmund shifted carefully, wincing. Why are you doing this? What do you want? I want you to recover. I want you to heal. Richard paused. I want a chance to be your father again, if you'll let me. You gave up that right 12 years ago. I know. But Edmund, you are still legally my son and heir. You are still entitled to your birthright. And Richard's voice broke, I am still your father, who made the worst mistake of his life, and wants the chance to atone for it. Edmund was quiet for a long moment. Then, tell me about Mother. Tell me how she really died, because I've spent 12 years believing I somehow killed her, and I need to know if that's true. Richard felt tears sting his eyes. She died of fever, Edmund, a sudden illness that the physicians couldn't treat. It had nothing to do with you. Nothing. You were a dutiful son who loved his mother. Her death was cruel random chance, not your fault. Then why did you blame me? Because I was drowning in grief and needed someone to blame. Because you were there and she wasn't. Because I was a coward who couldn't face my own pain, so I inflicted it on you instead. Richard leaned forward. There's no excuse for what I did, Edmund. I took a 17-year-old boy who had just lost his mother and threw him out into a world he wasn't prepared for. I condemned you to 12 years of suffering because I couldn't handle my own emotions. That's not your fault. It's mine. All of it is mine. Edmund stared at him, tears sliding down his still gaunt cheeks. I waited, he whispered. For 6 months, I waited in London, thinking you'd change your mind, thinking you'd send for me. I was so sure you would realize you'd made a mistake, but you never came. And eventually I ran out of money, and then I had to choose between eating and keeping decent clothes. And then I just fell so far that I couldn't find my way back up. I'm sorry, Richard said, the words utterly inadequate. Edmund, I'm so desperately sorry. I should have come after you. I should have realized. But I was too proud, too stubborn, too consumed by my own grief. By the time I'd pulled myself together enough to think clearly, I convinced myself you were better off without me. That you'd built a new life somewhere, found happiness I couldn't give you. I never... His voice broke completely. I never imagined this. I dreamed of this sometimes, Edmund said quietly. Dreamed that you'd find me and realize you were wrong. That you'd bring me home and tell me you loved me, and that everything would be all right. But then I'd wake up in a doorway or a flop house, and I'd remember that dreams are just cruelty for people like me. That hoping for things just makes the reality worse. This isn't a dream, Richard said. You're home, Edmund. And if you'll let me, if you can find it in yourself to give me a chance, I want to prove that I've changed. That I can be the father you needed 12 years ago. Edmund closed his eyes, fresh tears escaping. I don't know if I can do that. I don't know if I have the capacity left to trust you again. I understand. But will you stay? Will you stay here at Ravenswood and heal and let me take care of you, even if you never forgive me? Can you give me that much? Edmund was silent for so long that Richard thought he might refuse. Then, barely audibly, yes, I can give you that much. But Father, don't expect more. Don't expect me to suddenly be your son again, to fit back into the life you stole from me. I don't know how to be that person anymore. Then be whoever you are now, Richard said. I'll love you regardless. That's what fathers are supposed to do. But you didn't, Edmund said, his voice hollow. For 12 years you didn't. No, Richard agreed. I didn't. But I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to make up for that, even if it's impossible. Even if you hate me forever, I'm still going to try." Edmund turned his face away, but not before Richard saw the complicated emotions flickering across his features. Anger, grief, desperate yearning, and beneath it all, a tiny, fragile spark of hope that his son was clearly trying very hard to suppress. It was that spark that gave Richard his own hope, that maybe, impossibly, there was a way forward from this, that maybe 12 years of damage could begin to heal. It wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be quick. But Richard would spend every remaining day of his life working toward it, if Edmund would let him. Because he'd already lost 12 years with his son, he wouldn't lose another moment. Edmund's physical recovery was painstakingly slow. Dr. Morrison designed a careful refeeding program, gradually increasing the amount and richness of food Edmund could tolerate. The first few weeks were dangerous. Edmund's body, so long starved, threatened to rebel against proper nutrition. There were setbacks, nights where Richard thought they might lose him to the very care they were trying to provide. But Edmund survived. Slowly, painfully, his body began to remember what it meant to be adequately fed. The hollows in his cheeks filled in slightly. His eyes lost some of their haunted quality. He gained weight, though he remained far thinner than he should have been. The leg was another matter. Dr. Morrison and his colleagues designed a brace that helped Edmund walk with less pain, but the damage was permanent. Edmund would always limp, would always have limited mobility in that leg. "At least I can walk now," Edmund said one morning when Richard found him practicing in the gardens, supported by a cane. "For a while after the accident, I thought I'd never walk again at all." "What happened?" Richard asked. "You said it was a carriage accident?" "Cart, actually. I was loading cargo at the docks, trying to earn enough for a meal, when a cart got loose, pinned me against a wall, crushed the leg." Edmund's voice was matter-of-fact, as though he were describing something that happened to someone else. "The other dock workers pulled me free, but there was no money for a surgeon. Someone tried to set it, but they didn't know what they were doing. It healed wrong." "You worked the docks," Richard tried to imagine his son, raised as a gentleman, educated in literature and mathematics, and all the accomplishments expected of an heir, doing brutal manual labor. "I worked wherever I could, docks, factories, street corners. Did things I'm not proud of when there was no honest work." Edmunds didn't look at him. "You want to know what your banishment cost me, father? It cost me everything. My name, my dignity, my body, any belief that the world was fair or that I deserved kindness. It taught me that survival was the only thing that mattered, and that I'd do whatever was necessary to achieve it. Edmunds, I stole sometimes, when I was desperate enough. Never much. Bread from a cart, coins from inattentive merchants. Once I was caught, beaten so badly I couldn't move for 3 days. Thought I'd die in that alley." Edmund's voice remained flat, reciting atrocities as though they were mundane facts. "I begged, obviously. You saw that. I did other things too, things that would horrify you if I told you. Things that horrify me to remember. But they kept me alive, so I did them." "You don't have to tell me this," Richard said, his throat tight. "Don't I? You wanted to know what happened to me. This is what happened. I became whatever I needed to be to survive another day." "That's what you made me into, when you threw me away, a creature that knew only survival and fear. I'm sorry." "Stop apologizing." Edmund's voice rose, cracked with emotion. "Stop saying you're sorry as if that fixes anything. You weren't there when I was starving. You weren't there when I was beaten. You weren't there when I lay in that hospital ward after the cart accident, knowing my leg was ruined, knowing I'd never work again, knowing I was probably going to die." He was breathing hard now, tears streaming down his face. "You were here, in your comfortable home. living your comfortable life while I suffered for a crime I didn't commit. So don't tell me you're sorry. Sorry means nothing." Richard stood there and took it, because Edmund was right. Sorry was utterly inadequate for what he'd done. "You're right," he said when Edmund had run out of words. "Sorry isn't enough. Nothing I can say is enough. But Edmund, what else can I do? I can't undo the past. I can't give you back those 12 years. All I can do is try to build something better going forward. And if that's not enough for you, if you need to rage at me, to hate me, to punish me, then do it. I'll take whatever you need to give, because it's what I deserve." Edmund stared at him, chest heaving. Then he turned away, leaning heavily on his cane. "I don't know what I need. I don't know if I can forgive you. I don't know if I even want to try." "Then don't," Richard said. "Don't forgive me if you can't. But stay. Heal. Let me provide for you the way I should have done 12 years ago. Not because it earns forgiveness, but because it's simply the right thing to do." Edmund was quiet for a long time. Then, without looking back, "I'll stay. For now. But Father, don't expect me to be grateful. Don't expect me to suddenly love you again. I don't know if I can." "I understand," Richard said. And he did. He understood that love, once broken so completely, might never fully repair. That trust, once destroyed, might never be rebuilt. But he had to try, because Edmund was his son, and Richard had already failed him catastrophically. He wouldn't fail him again. 3 months into Edmund's recovery, Richard received a visitor that would change everything. Lady Catherine Blackwood arrived at Ravenswood Manor on a crisp spring morning, traveling alone except for her maid and footman, a breach of propriety for an unmarried lady of quality. But Catherine had never been particularly concerned with propriety. She was 30 years old, widowed after a brief marriage that had ended with her husband's death from consumption, and possessed of both a fortune and a fierce independence that made her one of the most respected and slightly feared women in their social circle. She was also Edmund's former betrothed. "Your Grace," Catherine said when Richard received her in his study, "thank you for seeing me on such short notice." "Lady Catherine, this is unexpected." Richard gestured for her to sit. "What brings you to Ravenswood?" "Edmund," Catherine said bluntly. "I heard he'd returned. I needed to see if it was true." Richard went still. "How did you hear?" "Your household staff talked to other household staffs. Word travels. I heard that Edmund Ashworth, who disappeared 12 years ago and was presumed dead by many, had suddenly reappeared at Ravenswood in terrible condition." Catherine's dark eyes were sharp. "Is it true? Is Edmund here?" Richard considered lying, considered protecting Edmund from this complication. But Catherine deserved honesty. She'd been 17 when Edmund disappeared, devastated by the loss of her betrothed and her friend. "It's true," he said. "I found him." Richard's voice caught. "I found him begging at Ravenswood's gates. He'd been living on the streets, surviving however he could. He was injured, starving, barely alive." Catherine went pale. "My God, where has he been all this time?" "London, mostly, working whatever jobs he could find." "He had an accident 3 years ago that damaged his leg. Since then," Richard couldn't finish. "I need to see him," Catherine said. "Please, Your Grace. Edmund and I were friends before we were betrothed. I've spent 12 years not knowing what happened to him. Please." Richard hesitated. Edmund had barely left his room since the confrontation in the garden. He took meals alone, read voraciously as though making up for years without access to books, and avoided Richard whenever possible. "He's not well," Richard warned. "Physically, he's recovering, but emotionally, Catherine, he's not the boy you knew. He's been through things that changed him fundamentally." "I understand, but I still need to see him. If he'll see me." Richard sent a servant to inquire. 5 minutes later, the man returned with Edmund's curt agreement to receive Lady Catherine in the library. Richard escorted Catherine there personally. Edmund was standing by the window, leaning heavily on his cane, his posture defensive. He'd gained some weight in the past 3 months, but he was still too thin, and the lines of hardship hadn't left his face. "Catherine," Edmund said, his voice carefully neutral. "Edmund!" Catherine's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't move toward him. You're alive." Disappointed? There was a bitter edge to Edmund's voice. Relieved, overjoyed, confused. Catherine glanced at Richard. "Might we speak privately, Your Grace?" Richard looked at Edmund, who gave a small nod. "I'll be in my study," Richard said, and left them alone. He didn't mean to eavesdrop, but the library door didn't quite close properly, and voices carried. 12 years, Catherine said. "Edmund, where were you?" "Living in hell, mostly." Edmund's voice was flat. "Working jobs no gentleman should have to work, sleeping in places no person should have to sleep, becoming someone I didn't recognize. Where did you think I was? I thought you were dead. We all did." Your father wouldn't speak of you, wouldn't explain what happened. He simply said you'd left and weren't coming back. Most people assumed some tragedy had befallen you. A tragedy did befall me. My father threw me out and told me never to return. I was 17, Catherine, 17, grieving my mother with no money and no prospects. What did he think would happen? There was a long silence. Then Catherine said, quietly, "I would have helped you. If I'd known, if you'd come to me, I would have helped." "How? You were 17 too, unmarried. You had no power, no resources of your own." "I had my family. They would have." "They would have nothing," Edmund interrupted. "No family takes in a son his own father has disowned. That's not how society works, Catherine. You know that. I could have tried." "And ruined your own prospects in the process." Edmund's voice softened slightly. "I'm glad you didn't know, Catherine. I'm glad you went on to have a life. Better that than dragging you down with me." "My life has been fine," Catherine said, "but it would have been better if my friend had disappeared, if the boy I was supposed to marry hadn't vanished as though he never existed." "That boy doesn't exist anymore." Edmund moved away from the window, his cane tapping against the floor. "He died somewhere in the last 12 years, in a flophouse or an alley or one of the countless places where I learned that hope is a luxury the desperate can't afford. I'm someone else now, Catherine, someone you wouldn't recognize, someone you wouldn't want to know." "Let me decide that," Catherine said firmly. "Edmund, I'm not 17 anymore. I'm not some delicate flower whole wilt at the reality of hardship. I've buried a husband. I've managed estates and finances and dealt with men who think my widowed status makes me vulnerable. I'm stronger than I was, and I can handle whatever truth you need to tell me." "Can you?" Edmund's voice carried a challenge. "Can you handle knowing that I've stolen and begged and done things I'm ashamed of? Can you handle knowing that I've slept in sewers and eaten garbage and let men use me in ways that would make you sick if I described them? Can you handle knowing that the Edmund you remember, the gentleman, the scholar, the boy who quoted poetry and dreamed of making a difference, is gone, replaced by someone who learned that survival is all that matters?" The silence that followed was profound. Richard, listening from the hallway, felt his heart break again for his son, for the innocence Edmund had lost, for the person he'd been forced to become. "Yes," Catherine said finally, "I can handle all of that, because all of that is what was done to you, Edmund, not who you are. You survived 12 years of hell that you shouldn't have had to survive. That doesn't make you less than. It makes you remarkably, impossibly strong." Edmund laughed, but it was a broken sound. "Strong? I'm not strong, Catherine. I'm damaged, broken, used up. Why are you even here? What could you possibly want from me? I want my friend back. The boy who used to debate philosophy with me in your mother's garden. The young man who made me laugh and challenged my thinking and treated me like an equal rather than a decorative accessory. Catherine's voice was steady. I know that boy is buried under 12 years of trauma, but I think he's still there, Edmund, and I want to help him find his way back. What if he can't come back? What if this is all that's left? Then I'll be friends with who you are now. But Edmund, you're still in there. I can see it. In the way you speak, in your references, in the fact that you're clearly reading voraciously despite everything else you're dealing with. She paused. You're not as lost as you think you are. I don't know how to be who I was, Edmund whispered. I don't know how to be a gentleman or an heir or anything other than someone who survives. I don't fit here anymore, Catherine. Not in this house, not in this life, not anywhere. Then we'll figure it out together. You, me, your father. We'll figure out where you fit now. It might not be where you fit before. That's all right. People change. Lives change. But Edmund, you deserve a chance to build something new. Don't you think? Richard heard Edmund's breath catch, heard what might have been a sob. I don't know what I deserve anymore, Edmund said. You deserve kindness. You deserve safety. You deserve people who care about you and want you to heal. Catherine's voice was fierce now. You deserve all the things your father took from you when he threw you out, and I'm going to help you reclaim them, whether you think you deserve them or not. Richard chose that moment to make his presence known, knocking lightly on the half-open door. Both Edmund and Catherine turned to look at him. Forgive the interruption, Richard said, but Lady Catherine, would you consider staying at Ravenswood for a time as our guest? It seems you and Edmund have much to discuss, and it might be easier if you were here rather than making day trips from your estate. Catherine looked at Edmund. Would that be all right with you? Edmund was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. Yes, I think I'd like that. Then it's settled, Richard said. I'll have Mrs. Patterson prepare rooms. Catherine, thank you for coming, for seeing Edmund, for being willing to help him in ways I haven't known how to. Catherine's expression softened. He was my friend first, Your Grace. Before he was your son, before he was my betrothed, he was my friend, and I don't abandon my friends. The implied criticism of Richard's own abandonment hung in the air, but Richard accepted it. He deserved it. Neither do I, Richard said quietly. Not anymore. Never again. Catherine's presence at Ravenswood changed the household dynamic in ways Richard hadn't anticipated. She was brisk, practical, and utterly unafraid to call out either Ashworth man when they were being foolish. She drew Edmund out in ways Richard couldn't, engaging him in debates about books and philosophy, playing chess with him in the evenings, taking walks through the gardens where they talked about everything and nothing. She treated Edmund neither as a broken thing to be pitied, nor as the pristine heir he'd once been, but simply as Edmund, complex, damaged, but still fundamentally himself. You need to engage with your father, Richard overheard her telling Edmund one afternoon. I know you're angry. You have every right to be angry, but this silent treatment helps no one. He doesn't deserve my engagement, Edmund replied. He threw me away, Catherine. He told me I killed my mother. He let me suffer for 12 years without once trying to find me. You're right, he doesn't deserve it. But Edmund, he's trying now. Imperfectly, awkwardly, but he's trying. And you're here, in his house, letting him support you. At some point, you're going to have to decide whether you want reconciliation or whether you simply want revenge. Maybe I want both. You can't have both. Revenge requires keeping him at arm's length, maintaining your anger, refusing to engage. Reconciliation requires the opposite: vulnerability, honesty, willingness to move forward even when the past still hurts. Catherine paused. I'm not saying you have to forgive him, Edmund. I'm saying you have to decide what you want your relationship with him to be, and then act accordingly. This limbo you're both in, it's not sustainable. Edmund was quiet for a long time. Then, what if I try and it doesn't work? What if I open myself up to him again and he destroys me a second time? Then at least you'll know you tried. But Edmund, your father isn't the same man who threw you out 12 years ago. Grief does terrible things to people. It made him cruel when he should have been kind. But he's pulled himself out of that grief now. He sees what he did. He's devastated by it. Give him a chance to prove he's changed. Why are you defending him? Edmund asked. After what he did to me, why are you taking his side? I'm not taking his side. I'm taking yours. Catherine's voice was gentle. And what's best for you, Edmund, is not spending the rest of your life carrying this anger and hurt. What's best for you is finding some way to heal, some way to build a future that's not defined by your past. Your father is offering you that chance. It would be a shame to refuse it simply because you're too afraid to be vulnerable again. Richard moved away from the doorway before either of them could discover him eavesdropping, but Catherine's words stayed with him. She was right. They were in limbo, he and Edmund, neither moving forward nor truly separating. Something had to change. That evening, Richard knocked on Edmund's door. His son was reading by the fire, his damaged leg propped on an ottoman. "May I come in?" Richard asked. Edmund looked up, surprise flickering across his face. "It's your house. It's your room, your sanctuary. I won't intrude if you don't want me here." For a moment, Richard thought Edmund would refuse. Then his son gestured to the chair opposite his own. "You can come in." Richard entered and sat, suddenly nervous in a way he hadn't been since Edmund's return. "I've been thinking about what you said, about my apologies being insufficient. And you're right. Sorry isn't enough. Nothing I can say is enough. So instead, I want to tell you something true." Richard met Edmund's eyes. "Throwing you out was the worst mistake of my life. Not just because of what it did to you, though that's horrifying enough, but because it destroyed me too. I spent 12 years in a kind of hell of my own making, living in this house that felt like a mausoleum, going through the motions of life without really living, knowing that I'd destroyed the one person who mattered most to me, and being too proud to admit it. You could have found me," Edmund said. "If you'd really wanted to, you could have searched." "You're right. I could have. I should have. And I didn't, because I was a coward. Because admitting I was wrong would have meant facing how much damage I'd done, and I wasn't brave enough for that." Richard leaned forward. "But Edmund, I want you to know something. Not a day went by, not a single day in 12 years, when I didn't think about you. Didn't wonder where you were, if you were safe, if you were happy. I told myself you must have built a new life somewhere, found success I couldn't give you. I never," his voice broke, "I never imagined this, that you'd been suffering, surviving, struggling just to stay alive, if I'd known." "But you didn't know, because you didn't look," Edmund said flatly. "You were content to imagine I was fine rather than actually checking." "Yes, and that's unforgivable. But Edmund, I'm asking anyway, not for forgiveness because I don't deserve it, but for a chance to prove that I've changed, that I can be the father you needed then and still need now. A chance to build something new between us, even if the old relationship is dead and buried." Edmund stared at him for a long time. What would that even look like? This new relationship? "I don't know," Richard admitted. "I suppose we'd have to figure it out together. But Edmund, I want to know you. Not the boy you were, but the man you've become. I want to understand what you've been through, not so I can pity you, but so I can appreciate how remarkably strong you must be to have survived it. I want to support whatever future you want to build, whether that's taking over the estate someday or doing something completely different. I want to be part of your life, if you'll let me. Why? Edmund's voice was raw. Why do you want that now when you didn't want it 12 years ago? Because 12 years ago, I was drowning in grief and couldn't see past my own pain. I looked at you and saw only my loss, your mother's absence, my own failure to save her, the impossibility of moving forward. Richard felt tears on his cheeks. But I should have seen you, Edmund, you who had lost just as much as I had. You who needed me to be strong when I was weakest. You who deserved a father who would help you through grief rather than adding to it. I should have seen you, and I didn't. That's my greatest shame. Edmund's own eyes were wet. I needed you so badly. When Mother died, when everything fell apart, I needed you, and you weren't there. You were the one person I thought would always be there, and you threw me away like I meant nothing. I know, Richard whispered, and I can never make that right. But Edmund, you did mean something. You meant everything. I was just too broken to remember that until it was too late. You were never the problem. My inability to handle grief, that was the problem. And you paid the price for my failure. Stop making excuses for yourself. Edmund's voice rose. Stop explaining why you did it. Just tell me the truth. Did you love me? When you threw me out, did you love me at all? Yes, Richard said without hesitation. God help me, yes. I've loved you every day of your life, Edmund. Even when I was cruelest to you, even when I said unforgivable things, even when I sent you away, I loved you. That's what makes it so much worse. I loved you, and I destroyed you anyway. Edmund sobbed, a broken, painful sound that seemed torn from somewhere deep inside. That doesn't make sense. If you loved me, how could you? Because love doesn't prevent people from doing terrible things when they're in pain. Because I was so consumed by my own suffering that I couldn't see yours. Because I'm human and flawed and capable of terrible mistakes, even when I love someone desperately. Richard stood and moved to Edmund's chair, kneeling beside it. I loved you then, and I love you now. Nothing you could do, nothing that's been done to you, nothing about who you've become would change that. You're my son. You'll always be my son. And I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of that relationship, even if I never fully succeed. Edmund turned his face into his hands and wept, deep, racking sobs that shook his thin frame. Richard did the only thing he could think to do. He wrapped his arms around Edmund and held him while he cried, offering the physical comfort he should have offered 12 years ago. I missed you, Edmund choked out between sobs. I hated you, and I missed you, and I wanted you to find me, and I never wanted to see you again, and I don't know how to reconcile all of that. You don't have to reconcile it, Richard said. You can feel all of those things simultaneously. They're all valid, Edmund. All of your anger, all of your hurt, all of your complicated feelings, they're all justified, and I'll accept every one of them. They stayed like that for a long time, father holding son, both of them crying, both of them trying to find some way through the wreckage of 12 lost years. Finally, Edmund pulled back, wiping his face with his sleeve. I can't promise I'll ever be all right with what you did. I know. I can't promise I'll forgive you. I know. But, Edmund took a shaky breath, I want to try. To have some kind of relationship with you. Not the one we had before, That's dead. But maybe something new, something honest, where I can be angry when I need to be angry, and you don't expect me to just get over it. That sounds like a good start, Richard said carefully. What do you need from me to make that possible? Edmund considered. Honesty. No more pretending. If you're struggling, tell me. If you're having regrets about taking me back in, tell me. I can't trust you if you're hiding things from me. I can do that. And patience. I'm going to have bad days. Days when I can barely look at you without remembering what you did. Days when I'll lash out or shut down or push you away. You have to let me have those days without taking it personally. I can do that too. And Edmund hesitated. And tell me about Mother. Real stories, not just she was wonderful and we loved you. I need to remember who she was, and you're the only one left who can help me do that. Richard felt his throat tighten. I'd be honored to share those stories with you. Edmund nodded slowly. Okay, then we can try. This new relationship, whatever it looks like, we can try. Thank you, Richard said. That's more than I deserve, but thank you. You're right. It is more than you deserve. But Edmund's voice held the faintest hint of warmth. Don't make me regret it, Father. I won't, Richard promised. I swear to you, Edmund, I won't. The weeks that followed were not easy, but they were honest. Edmund had bad days, as he'd warned, days when he could barely tolerate Richard's presence, when rage and grief overwhelmed him. Richard learned to give his son space during those times, to accept Edmund's anger without defensiveness, to simply be present without demanding anything in return. And slowly, painfully, they began to build something new. Richard told Edmund stories about Elizabeth, about their courtship, their marriage, the way she'd cried when Edmund was born, and declared him the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. He told Edmund about his childhood, the things Richard had loved about him as a boy, the pride he'd felt watching his son grow. Edmund, in turn, began to share fragments of his 12 years away. Not all at once. The memories were too painful for that, but in small pieces. The jobs he'd worked, the people who'd helped him. The narrow escapes and the moments when he'd come close to giving up entirely. There was a woman, Edmund said one evening over dinner, Mrs. Fletcher. She ran a charity kitchen in Southwark. She fed me for free sometimes when she could tell I was at my limit. Never asked questions, never made me feel ashamed. Just gave me soup and bread and told me to come back any time. He paused. When I was in the hospital after my leg was crushed, she came to see me. Brought me books. I don't know how she even knew where I was. She sounds remarkable, Richard said. She was. Is. Edmund looked down at his plate. I'd like to do something for her charity, if that would be all right. Of course, Richard said immediately. Whatever you want to do. The estate's resources are available to you, Edmund. They always have been. You're my heir. Everything I have is ultimately yours. Edmund looked up sharply. Even after? Even after everything. You're still my son, still the heir. That never changed, Edmund, even when everything else did. Catherine, dining with them as she often did now, smiled. That's an excellent idea, Edmund, and I'd like to contribute as well. We could establish a fund in Mrs. Fletcher's name. Make sure her charity is permanently endowed. You do that? Edmund asked. Of course. You're not the only person who benefits from kindness being repaid. Catherine's expression was warm. Besides, any woman who took care of you when you needed it deserves recognition and support. They began planning the charity endowment that very evening, and Richard watched Edmund come alive in a way he hadn't since his return. This giving back, this ability to help others who had helped him, seemed to heal something in Edmund that all Richard's apologies never could. Over the following months, Edmund threw himself into philanthropic work. He established multiple charitable funds for workhouse children, for injured laborers, for anyone struggling at the margins of survival the way he once had. He used his education and his position as heir to the Ravenswood dukedom to advocate for reforms in labor laws and poverty relief. "You found your purpose," Catherine observed one afternoon, watching Edmund review applications for aid from his newly established foundation. "I have," Edmund agreed. "I spent 12 years being helpless, being the person who needed rescuing. Now I can be the person who does the rescuing. It feels—" He paused, searching for words. "It feels right. Like maybe all that suffering wasn't entirely pointless if I can use it to help others." Richard, overhearing this conversation, felt pride swell in his chest. His son, the boy he'd thrown away, had become a man of remarkable compassion and purpose. Edmund was using his pain to fuel positive change, to ensure that others didn't suffer as he had suffered. "You're extraordinary," Richard told Edmund later that evening. "What you're doing with these charities, with your advocacy work, your mother would be so proud." Edmund was quiet for a moment. Then, would she? Or would she be disappointed that it took so much suffering to make me care about these things? "She'd be proud," Richard said firmly. "And Edmund, I'm proud too, of who you've become despite everything that was done to you. You could have emerged from those 12 years bitter and cruel, using your restored position to extract revenge on a world that hurt you. Instead, you're using it to help others. That's the definition of strength." "I had good teachers," Edmund said. "Mrs. Fletcher taught me that kindness matters. The dock workers who helped me after my accident taught me that community matters. And you," he paused, "you've been teaching me that healing is possible even when it seems impossible." "I'm still learning that myself," Richard admitted. "Then, well, learn it together," Edmund said. And for the first time since his return, he reached out and took Richard's hand. It was a small gesture, brief, but to Richard it meant everything. 2 years after Edmund's return to Ravenswood, Catherine made an announcement that surprised no one who'd been paying attention. "I'd like to marry your son," she told Richard over tea one afternoon. "That is, if he'll have me, and if you approve." Richard set down his cup carefully. "Does Edmund know you're asking me this?" "Not yet. I wanted to ensure you'd support the match before I proposed to him." Catherine's expression was serene. "I know it's unconventional for the woman to do the proposing, but then nothing about my relationship with Edmund has been conventional." "You love him," Richard said. "It wasn't a question." "I do. I've loved him since we were children, in various ways. As a friend, as a betrothed, as someone I thought I'd lost forever." Catherine met his eyes. "And I love who he's become. He's not the boy I was supposed to marry 12 years ago. He's better, more complex, more compassionate, more real. And yes, he's damaged, but aren't we all in our own ways? You're willing to take on his trauma, his nightmares, his bad days, all the ways those 12 years still affect him? I'm willing to love him through all of it, yes." Catherine's voice was firm. "Edmund isn't a project to be fixed, Your Grace. He's a man who's survived extraordinary hardship and is still capable of love and joy and purpose. I'd be honored to spend my life with him." Richard felt his eyes sting. "Then you have my blessing. And Catherine, thank you. For seeing him, for valuing him, for being patient with both of us as we've tried to rebuild what I destroyed. You're welcome. Though I should mention, I'm not just marrying Edmund. I'm marrying into this family, which means you're getting me as a daughter-in-law. I'm going to expect you to continue working on your relationship with your son. I'm going to hold you accountable when you fall short, and I'm going to interfere shamelessly in your lives, because that's what family does." "I wouldn't expect anything less," Richard said with a small smile. Catherine proposed to Edmund that evening in the rose garden where they'd spent so much time as children. She told Richard about it later, her face glowing. "He said yes. After staring at me for a full minute as though I'd lost my mind, he said yes. Catherine laughed. He also said I was making a terrible decision and that he was a poor prospect as a husband, but I told him I'd make that assessment myself, thank you very much. When? Richard asked. 3 months. Long enough to plan properly, but not so long that Edmund has time to convince himself he's not worthy. Catherine's expression softened. He's already trying to talk himself out of it, saying I deserve better, that his nightmares and his trauma and his damaged leg make him a burden rather than a partner. I'm going to have to spend the next 3 months convincing him that he's exactly who I want. He's lucky to have you, Richard said. We're lucky to have each other, Catherine corrected. And Your Grace, you're lucky to him too. Don't forget that. Your son is an extraordinary man. Treat him accordingly. The wedding took place at Ravenswood on a perfect June day. Edmund looked healthier than he had in years, still too thin, still bearing the marks of his suffering, but vital and present in a way that made Richard's heart swell with pride and relief. As Richard walked Edmund down the aisle, a reversal of traditional roles that Edmund had insisted upon, he leaned close and whispered, "Your mother would be so happy to see this, to see you happy." "I hope so," Edmund whispered back. "I hope she knows I survived, that I'm all right now, that I found my way back." "She knows," Richard said with certainty, "and she's proud of you, just as I am." Edmund's hand tightened on Richard's arm, a gesture of forgiveness, or at least acceptance, that meant more to Richard than any words could express. At the altar, Catherine waited with a smile that could have lit up the darkest night. And when Edmund took her hand, when they spoke their vows to each other, Richard saw his son's face transform with joy had once thought Edmund would never feel again. The reception was a celebration of not just a marriage, but of survival, of healing, of a family rebuilt from ashes and anger and 12 years of absence. "You did well," Catherine told Richard during the dancing, "with Edmund, with giving him the space to heal and the support to rebuild himself. You did well." "I did the bare minimum of what a father should do," Richard corrected. "Edmund did the hard work of healing himself." "Perhaps, but he couldn't have done it without you, without knowing that he had someone in his corner, someone who would be there even when he pushed them away," Catherine smiled. "That's what love looks like, Your Grace. Not perfection, but persistence. Not being right, but being present. You gave Edmund that gift. Don't diminish it." Richard watched Edmund and Catherine waltz together, watched his son smile with an openness that had taken years to reclaim. And he thought about 12 years ago, about the terrible mistake that had nearly cost him everything. He couldn't undo those years, couldn't give Edmund back what had been stolen, but he could be here now, present and committed and working every day to be the father Edmund needed. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough to balance the scales. But it was something, and sometimes something was where redemption began. Epilogue. 5 years after Edmund's return to Ravenswood, Richard stood in the nursery and held his first grandchild, a daughter Catherine and Edmund had named Elizabeth after Edmund's mother. "She has her grandmother's eyes," Richard murmured, studying the infant's face. "She does," Edmund agreed, watching from the doorway. His leg was better now. The brace and continued treatment had improved his mobility significantly, though he would always limp. I wanted Mother's name to continue, wanted this little one to carry something of who she was." "Your mother would be honored," Richard said. He looked up at Edmund. "And she'd be so proud of you, of the father you're going to be." "I'm terrified," Edmund admitted, moving into the nursery. "What if I'm terrible at it? What if I damage her the way—" He stopped. "The way I damaged you," Richard finished quietly. "It's all right, Edmund. You can say it. I wasn't going to. But it's what you were thinking." Richard returned his attention to baby Elizabeth. "And it's a fair concern. But Edmund, you're not me. You've already proven yourself to be more compassionate, more present, more emotionally available than I ever was with you as a child. This little girl is lucky to have you as her father." Edmund moved closer, reaching out to touch his daughter's tiny hand. "I'm going to do better. Be better. I'm going to make sure she always knows she's loved and valued, that her worth isn't conditional on being perfect or meeting some impossible standard." "I know you will," Richard said. "You've already survived the worst kind of fathering possible. You know what not to do. That gives you a significant advantage." "That's not funny," Edmund said, but there was no real anger in his voice. They'd reached a place where they could acknowledge the past without being destroyed by it, where they could even find grim humor in survival. "No," Richard agreed, "but it's true. And Edmund, thank you." "For what?" "For giving me another chance. For letting me back into your life when you had every reason to keep me out. For allowing me to be here for this moment, meeting my granddaughter, seeing you become a father." Richard's voice thickened. "For forgiving me, even partially, even grudgingly." "I haven't fully forgiven you," Edmund said. "I don't know if I ever will completely. There are still days when I remember what you did and I feel that old anger and hurt." "I know. That's fair." "But," Edmund paused, "I'm glad you're here. Glad you found me when you did. Glad we had these 5 years to rebuild something, even if it's not what we lost. This," he gestured around the nursery, at the evidence of the life he'd built, "this wouldn't have been possible without you. Without Ravenswood, without the resources you've given me access to, without the emotional support as I've healed. So thank you too, Father, for not giving up on me, for trying." Richard felt tears slide down his cheeks. 5 years ago, he'd found his son begging at Ravenswood's gates, broken and starving, and convinced he was worthless. Now, that same son was a husband, a father, a philanthropist working to change lives across England. He'd built something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy. And Richard had been allowed to witness it, to support it, to be part of Edmund's healing journey. "She's going to be extraordinary," Richard said, looking down at baby Elizabeth. "With you and Catherine as parents, how could she be anything else?" "I hope so," Edmund said softly. I hope we can give her a childhood full of love and security, the kind I should have had, the kind you would have given me if grief hadn't broken you, the kind you'll give her because you know the cost of withholding it," Richard said. "You're going to be a wonderful father, Edmund. I'm certain of it." Catherine appeared in the doorway, drawn by their voices. She smiled at the scene. 3 generations of Ashworths, connected by blood and by the complicated bonds of love and redemption. "Are you two going to monopolize my daughter all evening?" she asked with gentle amusement. "Yes," Edmund and Richard said simultaneously, then looked at each other and laughed. "Well, at least you agree on something," Catherine said. She moved to join them, wrapping an arm around Edmund's waist. "Though I suppose I should be grateful you're both so besotted with her. Better too much love than too little." "Always too much love," Edmund agreed, pressing a kiss to his wife's temple. "That's the rule in this family now. Too much love, too much presence, too much commitment to being there for each other. We've had enough of the alternative." Richard nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. He'd spent 12 years in the alternative, in absence and regret and self-imposed isolation. He'd almost lost Edmund permanently to his own cowardice and cruelty. But he'd been given a second chance, an opportunity to do better, to be better, to prove that people could change and relationships could heal even after profound damage. He was determined not to waste it. "Too much love," he echoed, his voice rough with emotion. "That sounds exactly right. And holding his granddaughter, watching his son and daughter-in-law smile at each other with the easy affection of a strong marriage, Richard felt something he hadn't felt in 17 years, complete, uncomplicated happiness. It couldn't erase the past, couldn't undo the suffering he'd caused, but it could exist alongside that past, offering hope that redemption was possible, that broken things could sometimes be repaired, and that love, persistent, imperfect, but genuine, could bridge even the widest chasms. He'd found his son begging at Ravenswood's gates, reduced to nothing by Richard's own cruelty. And now, 5 years later, they stood together in the nursery of that same house, celebrating new life and second chances and the messy, complicated, beautiful work of rebuilding what had been broken. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. The scars remained. The memories couldn't be erased. Edmund would carry the trauma of those 12 years for the rest of his life. But they'd survived. Together. And that was its own kind of triumph. The end.